In the spring of 1865, the war ended, but peace did not arrive all at once. It came unevenly, cautiously, and in many places, not at all. For millions of enslaved people across the United States, the announcement of freedom was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of confusion, of disbelief, of fear, because freedom, when it arrived, did not come with instructions. No land was distributed, no protection was guaranteed, no safety net existed. Former slaves were suddenly expected to survive in a country that had spent centuries ensuring they could not. And nowhere was this more dangerous than in towns far from federal power. Towns like Redwood Crossing. Let me know in the comments section which state and country are you listening from. Brave souls like you are true history seekers. So hit that subscribe button to get more dark history secrets. Now let's go back to our story. Redwood Crossing did not appear on most maps. It sat between rail lines, tucked among fields and tree lines, surrounded by land that had been cultivated through forced labor for generations. Before the war, nearly half the town's population was enslaved. They built the roads, they raised the buildings, they harvested the crops. When emancipation came, the land did not change hands. The people did. The enslaved became freedmen. The owners became employers. But the power remained exactly where it had always been. When Union troops passed through the region, they stayed only briefly. They read declarations. They raised flags. They moved on. And once they left, Redwood Crossing returned to silence. Freedom existed as a word, but not as a reality. Formerly enslaved families gathered in small groups, asking the same questions. Where do we go? What do we do now? Who will protect us? There were no answers. Most had never been allowed to learn to read. Few had any money. Leaving town meant walking into the unknown, often through hostile territory. So many stayed. They remained on the same land where they had been enslaved, living in the same cabins, working the same fields, now for wages that barely existed. It was freedom in name only. At first, the town appeared calm. White residents spoke of adjustment. Local leaders promised stability. Church sermons preached patience and obedience. But beneath the surface, resentment was growing. Former slaveholders felt humiliated by defeat. Poor white laborers feared competition. The social order had been disrupted, and someone had to pay for it. That someone was obvious. For the formerly enslaved people of Redwood Crossing, daily life became an exercise in restraint. They learned quickly which roads were safe, which men could be spoken to, which questions could not be asked. Eye contact became dangerous. Confidence became suspicious. Silence became a survival tactic. Even joy was risky. A black man laughing too loudly. A woman refusing an order. A family talking about leaving town. All of it could attract attention. And attention in Redwood Crossing was never neutral. The local courthouse reopened under the same officials who had governed before the war. The sheriff remained in place. So did the judges. So did the men who controlled land, food, and employment. The law did not change with emancipation. It adapted. Within months, rumors began circulating, not official announcements, not newspaper articles, whispers. Someone had been taken in the night. Someone had been arrested and never returned. Someone had left town, but no one knew where. At first, these stories were dismissed. People moved often after the war. Families were separated. Records were incomplete. But then patterns began to emerge. Men who talked about organizing labor disappeared. Women who refused exploitative contracts vanished. Entire families were suddenly gone, cabins left empty, belongings untouched. No one announced their departure. They simply stopped existing. One elderly man, once enslaved on the largest plantation near town, later recalled the shift. He said there was a moment when people stopped saying goodbye. They didn't tell neighbors they were leaving. They didn't pack publicly. They didn't make plans out loud. Because leaving wasn't the dangerous part. Being noticed was. Freedom had created a terrifying paradox. Former slaves were no longer property, but they were also no longer protected by ownership. They existed in a legal gray zone. And in that space, violence thrived. The church in Redwood Crossing preached reconciliation, but reconciliation required equality, and equality was unacceptable to many. Instead, sermons focused on knowing one's place, on obedience, on patience, on suffering quietly. Those messages weren't accidental, they were instructions. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere shifted. The town felt tense. White residents began forming informal patrols. Groups of men gathered after dark. Horses were prepared at night. And still, nothing was written down. Nothing was recorded. Nothing was investigated. Because nothing officially was happening. This is the most dangerous stage of historical violence. The stage where harm is normalized, where absence is explained away, where fear becomes routine. By the end of the first year after emancipation, Redwood Crossing had changed forever. Not because of freedom, but because of what freedom threatened. And this was only the beginning, because the disappearances were not random. They were systematic, and soon the town would find a way to make them legal. History rarely records the first disappearance, because the first one is easy to ignore. In Redwood Crossing, no bells rang, no alarms sounded, no notices were posted. One man simply did not come back. His name was Isaac Turner. At least that was the name he used after emancipation. Before freedom, he had been known only by a first name, spoken when needed, ignored when not. Isaac was in his early 30s, strong from years of forced labor, quiet but observant. After emancipation, he worked the same land he had always worked, only now he was paid a wage so small it barely covered food. Still, Isaac believed in the promise of freedom. He talked about saving money, about finding land somewhere else, about learning to read. That belief made him visible. On a Monday morning in late summer, Isaac didn't arrive at the fields. At first, no one worried. People overslept. People took other work. People left town. But Isaac didn't come the next day, or the day after that. His tools were still in his cabin. His boots were by the door. His jacket hung on a nail. He had not packed. He had not said goodbye. And yet no one asked questions, because asking questions was dangerous. At the end of the week, someone quietly mentioned Isaac's absence to the overseer. The overseer shrugged. "He probably ran off," he said. And that was the end of the conversation. A month later, Mary Ellis disappeared. Mary was older, perhaps in her 40s, and known for her defiance. She had refused to sign a new labor contract that would bind her to the same land indefinitely. She spoke openly about unfair wages. She was last seen walking home just before sunset. Her cabin stood near the tree line. The next morning her door was open. Her cooking pot still sat over cold ashes. She was gone. This time people noticed. Women whispered to one another while washing clothes by the river. Men spoke in low voices after work. The pattern was unsettling. Isaac, Mary, both had asserted independence. Both had disappeared without explanation. Still, no reports were filed. Because to file a report you had to go to the sheriff. And the sheriff was not neutral. By winter there were more. A young man named Thomas Reed, arrested for vagrancy, was taken to the jail and never returned. A mother and her 2 children vanished from a cluster of cabins near the road. An elderly man who had worked as a carpenter disappeared after refusing unpaid labor. Each case was different, but the outcome was always the same: no return. The disappearances followed a pattern that people recognized, but could not say aloud. Those who challenged authority spoke of leaving refused unfair contracts gathered in groups they went first. Those who kept their heads down lasted longer, but even silence offered no guarantee. What made the disappearances especially terrifying was how clean they were. No blood, no broken doors, no signs of struggle. People were taken quietly, usually at night, usually by more than one person. Witnesses later recalled sounds: hooves on dirt roads, wheels rolling slowly, murmured voices, never shouting, never gunfire, because noise attracted attention, and attention left evidence. Children learned early lessons. If someone didn't come home, you didn't ask where they went. If a cabin stood empty, you didn't touch what was inside. If adults stopped speaking mid-sentence, you stopped listening. Survival meant learning what not to notice. White residents of Redwood Crossing noticed too, but their reactions were different. Some claimed ignorance. Some approved silently. Others felt uneasy, but did nothing, because the disappearances benefited them. Fewer workers meant less resistance. Fear kept wages low. Silence maintained order. The local newspaper printed small notices from time to time. Laborer leaves town. Family relocates. Worker dismissed. No names, no details, no follow-ups. Absence was explained away with polite language. By the second year after emancipation, disappearances had become routine. They blended into daily life. Cabins emptied quietly. Fields were reassigned. Work continued. The town adjusted, but beneath that adjustment was terror. Formerly enslaved residents began creating invisible maps: safe paths, unsafe roads, times of day to avoid travel. They stopped walking alone. They avoided gatherings. They learned which houses had lights on late at night and which didn't. Some tried to leave. Few succeeded. Those who did never wrote back. Those who didn't vanished. One man later testified, years after leaving Redwood Crossing, that he had seen Isaac Turner again, briefly, in chains, marching with other prisoners toward a labor camp miles away. But no official record ever confirmed Isaac's arrest, which meant legally he had never existed. That was the true horror of Redwood Crossing. Not just that people disappeared, but that the system erased proof they had ever been there. Families mourned without funerals. Grief had to be private. Public mourning attracted attention. Attention attracted questions, and questions attracted consequences. By the time the town realized what was happening, it was already too late. Fear had settled in. Silence had taken root, and disappearance had become policy without ever being written down. Music drops lower, almost inaudible, because what Redwood Crossing was building was not chaos. It was control. Violence does not last long without permission. In Redwood Crossing, permission did not arrive in the form of mobs or riots. It arrived in ink, on paper, through laws written to look orderly, reasonable, and fair, but designed to erase people without consequence. These laws were known as Black Codes, and they transformed freedom into a trap. After the Civil War, Southern states faced a problem they had never planned for. Millions of formerly enslaved people were suddenly free. They could leave plantations. They could demand wages. They could refuse orders. To the men who had once owned them, this was unthinkable, so the system adapted. Black codes were passed under the justification of maintaining order. In practice, they criminalized everyday life. In Redwood Crossing, these laws were enforced aggressively. A black man could be arrested for not having proof of employment, walking along a road without permission, gathering with others after sunset speaking disrespectfully to a white resident. A black woman could be arrested for refusing domestic work, disorderly conduct, being outside after dark. The definitions were intentionally vague because vagueness created power. Employment contracts were another weapon. Former slaves were required to sign labor agreements, often binding them to a single landowner for an entire year. Breaking the contract was a crime. Leaving town without written permission was a crime. Quitting abusive work was a crime. Freedom existed only if you stayed exactly where you were. Those arrested were taken to the courthouse. The same courthouse that had once ruled slavery legal. The same judges. The same sheriff. The same juries composed entirely of white men. Trials, when they happened at all, were brief, sometimes lasting only minutes. Guilt was assumed. Punishment was guaranteed. But the punishment was not prison. It was something far worse. The state had discovered a loophole. If slavery was illegal, then forced labor could simply be called something else. Convict leasing. Under convict leasing, prisoners were rented out to private landowners, mines, railroads, and lumber camps. The state profited, the landowners profited, and the prisoners, they were disposable. In Redwood Crossing, records from nearby counties show a sudden explosion in arrests for vagrancy. Hundreds of formerly enslaved people were detained within a short period. Most were never formally sentenced. They were simply transferred, leased, removed. Once leased, prisoners had no rights, no protection, no expiration date on their punishment. If they died, they were replaced. If they disappeared, no one asked why. This system solved multiple problems at once. It punished independence. It supplied free labor. It eliminated resistance. And most importantly, it made disappearance legal. But here is where Redwood Crossing becomes especially disturbing. Because not everyone who vanished was arrested. Some people simply disappeared without ever passing through the courthouse. Which raises a chilling question. Where did the law end and something else begin? Former residents later recalled that arrests often followed rumors. Someone was talking about organizing workers. Someone refused a contract. Someone was seen leaving town after dark. The next day, the sheriff arrived. Charges were invented. The person was taken away, never to return. And then there were those who skipped the arrest entirely, those taken at night, those whose names never entered any ledger, those whose disappearances were unofficial, but still protected, because the law had created a climate where no explanation was required. Once a person was labeled a criminal, or even suspected of being one, their fate no longer mattered. The town accepted it, the courts justified it, and the newspapers ignored it. Even those who wanted to intervene were trapped. White residents who questioned arrests risked social and economic consequences. Black residents who protested risked immediate retaliation. Silence was the safest option, and silence spread quickly. Children learned the rules before they learned to read. Don't walk without papers. Don't talk back. Don't gather. Don't ask questions. Freedom became a series of conditions. Break one, and you disappeared. The brilliance of the system, if it can be called that, was that it required very little violence in public. Most of the brutality happened out of sight. In labor camps, in swamps, on rail lines, far from witnesses, far from records. By the time federal oversight began to fade during Reconstruction, the damage was already done. The legal infrastructure was in place. The habits were formed. The town knew how to erase people, and it knew how to do it quietly. Redwood Crossing no longer needed mobs. It had laws, and soon those laws would be enforced by men who didn't wear badges at all. Because the next phase did not involve courts, it involved the night. There is a moment in every system of oppression when the law is no longer enough, when paperwork feels too slow, when arrests feel too visible, when silence needs to be enforced more efficiently. In Redwood Crossing, that moment arrived quietly, and it arrived at night. People began to notice patterns that were never spoken aloud. Men gathering after sunset who were never seen together during the day. Horses kept saddled late into the evening. Lanterns moving along roads long after most homes had gone dark. No one announced what was happening. No one needed to, because everyone already knew. They were called many things later. Patrols, committees, protective groups. But among the people who feared them most, they were remembered simply as the Night Riders. They did not wear uniforms, they did not carry badges. That was the point. They were not officially connected to the law, which meant the law could deny responsibility. And it always did. Witnesses who survived described them as organized. Never fewer than 3, often 6 or more. They rode quietly, spoke little, moved with purpose. This was not chaos. This was procedure. The riders appeared where fear was already present. A cabin where someone had spoken too openly. A family rumored to be planning an escape. A man who had refused unpaid labor. They did not knock, they surrounded. Doors were opened because resisting only made things worse. People were dragged outside, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes beaten, sometimes neither. Violence was not always the goal. Removal was. Wagons waited on the road. Heavy, covered, people were loaded quickly. No shouting, no gunshots, because noise left witnesses. Children watched from doorways. Women clutched each other in silence. Men stood frozen, knowing that moving, even to help, could mean joining them. And then the riders vanished, taking the night with them. The next morning the town resumed its routine. Fields were worked. Stores opened. Church bells rang. The cabin stood empty, and no one asked why. What made the night riders especially powerful was that everyone knew who they were, but no one could prove it. They were farmers, merchants, deputies off duty, men who sat on juries. They blended back into daylight, which meant confronting them was impossible. People learned new rules. Never light a lantern too late at night. Never host gatherings after sunset. Never let strangers know your plans. And most importantly, never speak the rider's name. Some former slaves tried to appeal to the sheriff. The response was always the same. We don't know anything about that. Probably left town. No evidence of wrongdoing. The absence of evidence was the evidence. In some cases, the night riders delivered their victims to the legal system. A man taken at night would appear days later, arrested, charged, leased. This gave the illusion of legality. In other cases, people were never seen again. No charges, no records, just disappearance. Those cases were the most frightening, because they suggested something worse than prison. Rumors spread quietly. People spoke of labor camps so brutal that survival was unlikely, of swamps where bodies were dumped, of shallow graves dug hastily and forgotten. No one knew which stories were true, and no one wanted to find out. The writers did not target randomly. They targeted influence. A man others listened to, a woman others respected, a family others might follow. The goal was not just removal, it was example. After each disappearance, behavior changed. People stopped gathering, stopped resisting, stopped dreaming aloud. That was the real function of the night riders. Not terror, control. Even white residents who felt uneasy stayed silent. Some feared retaliation. Others feared exposure. Many simply benefited too much to intervene. Because the writers solved problems, labor disputes ended, land disputes disappeared, resistance collapsed. Church leaders preached calm, editors avoided the subject, officials claimed ignorance. The town performed innocence convincingly. And over time, the night riders became unnecessary, because fear had already done their work. By the early 1870s, people in Redwood Crossing no longer needed to be taken at night as often. The lesson had been learned. Freedom had limits, and crossing them came at a cost no one could afford. What makes this chapter of the story so disturbing is not just the violence, but how ordinary it became, how quickly terror blended into routine, how easily a town learned to look away. The night riders did not need to ride forever. They only needed to ride long enough for the town to police itself. And it worked, because when the next generation grew up, they inherited not just land and buildings, but silence. And that silence would protect what came next. History often asks the wrong question. It asks, who committed the crimes? But the more important question is this: who allowed them to continue? In Redwood Crossing, violence did not survive because everyone was cruel. It survived because no one intervened. And that silence was not accidental. It was built, piece by piece, into the town itself. To understand why no investigation ever happened, you must first understand who controlled Redwood Crossing. Power in the town rested with a small group of men. They owned the land. They controlled employment. They sat on juries. They financed the newspaper. They funded the church. And crucially, they elected the sheriff. The sheriff was not an outsider. He was born in the county, related by blood or marriage to half the town's leadership, economically dependent on the same men who feared losing control. Investigating disappearances would have meant investigating his neighbors, his friends, his employers. Judges were no different. They relied on local approval to remain in office. Their rulings reflected community expectations, and the community expectation was simple: do not disrupt the order. Then there was the press. The local newspaper printed church announcements, crop prices, and social notices. It did not print accusations. Editors understood the limits of acceptable reporting. Stories about missing black residents were framed carefully or not at all. Words like vanished were avoided. Instead, they used safer language. Left town, moved on, dismissed. Absence was rewritten as choice. Federal authorities technically had jurisdiction during Reconstruction, but they were understaffed, underfunded, and increasingly unwelcome. As national attention shifted elsewhere, enforcement weakened. Towns like Redwood Crossing learned an important lesson: if you wait long enough, oversight ends. And waiting was easy, because the people most affected had the least power. Former slaves had no political representation, no legal resources, no protection. Complaints could be dismissed without consequence. Testimony could be ignored. Disappearance did not count as a crime if the victim was not considered fully human. Even when rumors reached officials outside the town, they lacked evidence. No bodies, no records, no witnesses willing to speak publicly. Fear ensured cooperation with silence. There was also another reason no investigation occurred, one that is harder to confront. Many people benefited. Land ownership consolidated. Wages stayed low. Resistance vanished. Economic stability, at least for some, was preserved. Investigating disappearances threatened that stability. It threatened wealth. It threatened reputation. It threatened history itself. White residents who felt uneasy faced a moral dilemma: speak up and risk isolation, retaliation, or ruin. Stay silent and keep your livelihood. Most chose survival. The church played its part as well. Sermons emphasized forgiveness over justice, patience over accountability, suffering as a test of faith. These messages discouraged confrontation and framed silence as virtue. Over time, even memory began to fade. Children grew up without knowing who used to live in the empty cabins. Adults avoided the subject entirely. The disappearances became unspeakable, not because they were unknown, but because acknowledging them required responsibility. By the time decades passed, the truth had become fragmented. Stories survived only as whispers, as warnings, as things not to be talked about. This is how injustice survives, not through constant violence, but through normalization. Redwood Crossing did not investigate its disappearances because investigating would have meant admitting guilt. It would have meant acknowledging that freedom had been sabotaged, that crimes had been committed, that lives had been stolen, and that silence made everyone complicit. So instead, the town chose something easier: forgetfulness. The ticking clock slows, then stops, and in forgetting, it preserved its version of peace. But peace built on silence does not last forever, because eventually, the ground remembers. History often assumes that violence leaves scars, that atrocity weakens communities, that injustice eventually destabilizes systems. But Redwood Crossing tells a different story, because as people disappeared, the town flourished. By the mid-1870s, Redwood Crossing looked successful. Fields were productive. New buildings appeared along the main road. Businesses expanded. From the outside, it seemed like a place that had recovered from the war, even improved. What outsiders did not see was what that prosperity was built on. Land ownership changed quietly. Cabins once occupied by black families were abandoned. No heirs claimed them. No records existed. Land was absorbed, consolidated, transferred at little or no cost. Plantations grew larger. Smaller farms vanished. The same names began appearing on more deeds. The absence of people became opportunity. Labor shortages created by disappearance were solved efficiently. Convict leasing provided a steady supply of workers. Men in chains replaced free laborers. They worked longer hours, under harsher conditions, at lower cost. Death was expected and accounted for. Leases were written with replacement in mind. This was not hidden. It was normalized. Local businesses benefited as well. Black-owned shops disappeared. White-owned stores expanded. Credit was extended selectively. Debt was enforced aggressively. Economic mobility followed predictable lines. The railroad's arrival was celebrated as progress. Tracks cut through land once worked by families now gone. Rail cars carried crops and timber out of the region. Wealth flowed in, and the past was left behind. The town's narrative changed. Redwood Crossing began telling a story about itself, a story of resilience, of hard work, of overcoming wartime devastation. No mention was made of who did not make it into that future. Church attendance increased. Sunday sermons praised prosperity as a blessing, as proof of moral righteousness. Economic success was framed as divine approval, which made questioning it feel like heresy. New generations grew up without knowing what had been lost. Empty land felt normal. Silence felt inherited. History was something taught selectively. By the turn of the century, Redwood Crossing was considered stable, safe, respectable. Investors passed through without concern. Travelers saw no evidence of violence, because violence had already done its work. There were no ruins, no mass graves marked, no monuments to suffering, only neat fields, well-kept buildings, and a town that functioned smoothly. That is how systems built on injustice survive. They produce results. They reward compliance. They punish memory. Some former residents who escaped later described the transformation with bitterness. They spoke of seeing prosperity where families once lived, of passing businesses built on land stolen quietly, of returning to a place that no longer remembered them. But their testimonies went unheard, because success is convincing and prosperity is persuasive. Redwood Crossing did not see itself as cruel, it saw itself as efficient. Train whistle echoes again, then fades, and efficiency does not ask questions. For decades, Redwood Crossing kept its secret, not because the truth was gone, but because it was underground. In the early 20th century, progress arrived again. A new road was planned to connect Redwood Crossing to neighboring towns. Wider lanes, stronger foundations, faster transport. The project was celebrated as another sign of prosperity. Few questioned where the road would go. Even fewer questioned what lay beneath it. The work began quietly. Men dug into earth that had not been disturbed in generations. At first there was nothing unusual: rock, clay, roots. Then a shovel struck something that did not sound like stone. The worker stopped, dug more carefully. What emerged was unmistakable: bone. At first it was assumed to be an old burial, perhaps a forgotten cemetery. The foreman ordered work to continue a few feet away, but the bones kept appearing, not in a single grave, in clusters. Shallow, unmarked, a skull was found next, then another. Then fragments of ribcage, too many, too close together. The machinery was shut down. Word spread quietly through the worksite. This was not an accident. This was not ordinary. Local officials were notified. They arrived, surveyed the area, and spoke in hushed tones. There was no visible panic, no public announcement, just quick decisions made behind closed doors. The remains were described in records using neutral language: human remains, unmarked burials, historical in nature, no names, no estimated ages, no cause of death listed. There was no forensic investigation, no attempt to determine how many bodies were present, no effort to identify them. The bones were collected, removed, reburied elsewhere, or possibly not at all. The records are unclear. The road project resumed. Construction continued. The earth was sealed again. To the public, the discovery barely registered. A short notice appeared in the local paper. It mentioned old graves. Nothing more. No follow-up articles. No community meetings. No memorials. And just like that, the past was managed, contained, dismissed. But for some residents, the discovery changed everything. Older black families understood immediately what had been found. They did not need explanations. They had been waiting for this moment, even if they feared it. Whispers returned. Names resurfaced. Stories that had been suppressed for decades found space to breathe. Only briefly. Some people wanted answers. Who were they? How did they die? Why were they buried like this? But those questions led nowhere. Officials insisted the remains were too old to investigate, too degraded, too complicated, and perhaps most importantly, too inconvenient. The discovery threatened the town's story, its reputation, its comfort. So the town did what it had always done. It looked away. Children rode bicycles over the new road. Cars passed daily. Life continued. The ground was quiet again. But something had changed. Because once the truth surfaces, even briefly, it cannot be fully buried. Former residents who had left Redwood Crossing heard about the discovery years later. For them, it was confirmation. Proof that the disappearances were real, that they had not imagined the terror, that their grief had a physical presence. Still, no justice followed, no investigation reopened, no apology issued, no acknowledgement made. The discovery became a footnote, a rumor, a thing people avoided discussing. A low, almost imperceptible note begins to rise, but the earth had spoken, and it would not be the last time. There are places where history ends, and there are places where it simply stops speaking. Redwood Crossing is one of those places. Today it looks ordinary. There is nothing that warns you. No signs, no plaques, no markers. The road built over the bones is smooth now. Grass grows evenly on either side. Cars pass without slowing. If you walk through the town, you will see homes, stores, churches. You will hear children laughing. You will smell food cooking. Nothing feels haunted, and that is what makes it unsettling, because what happened here was not erased by time, it was erased by choice. The people who disappeared after freedom were not victims of a single event, they were victims of a process, a system that learned how to remove people quietly, how to benefit from their absence, how to forget without admitting forgetting. Silence became tradition. It was passed down like property, like land, like wealth. Children grew up learning what not to ask. Adults learned which stories ended conversations. Memory was edited carefully. Some families knew. They always knew. They carried the knowledge privately. They taught it as warning, not history. Don't draw attention. Don't trust promises. Don't assume freedom means protection. Others chose not to know, and not knowing was easier, because knowing would require reckoning. No official apology was ever issued. No investigation reopened. No names officially restored. The town never admitted wrongdoing, because admission would fracture the story it told itself. And yet, absence has weight. It leaves gaps that never fully close. Entire bloodlines ended. Entire futures erased. Children who were never born. Voices never heard. What was lost cannot be measured in numbers, because records were never kept. And that was intentional. The most effective violence leaves no paperwork. In recent years, scholars and historians have begun re-examining towns like Redwood Crossing. They've noticed patterns, unexplained population drops, missing census entries, sudden land transfers. They are finding the outlines of stories that were deliberately obscured, but history moves slowly, and justice moves slower still. For most residents, life continues unchanged. The past is distant, abstract, uncomfortable. But for those who know where to look, the silence is loud. Every empty field once held homes. Every quiet stretch of road passes over lives. Every success story has a shadow. This is the legacy of Redwood Crossing. Not just what happened, but what was allowed to disappear. Freedom was declared, but freedom was not protected. And when protection fails, freedom becomes dangerous. The men and women who vanished here did not leave willingly. They were removed, systematically, deliberately, and then forgotten. History often celebrates emancipation as an ending, but in places like this it was a beginning. The beginning of a quieter kind of violence, one that required no chains, only silence. And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is that Redwood Crossing was not unique. There were many towns like it, and some may still exist. The question is not whether this happened. It did. The question is, how many times did it happen without being noticed? And how many times are we still not looking?